The first time it happened, I didn't know what to feel. The air in the room was heavy, almost sacred, yet charged with an electric pulse that made my skin tingle. Every glance he cast my way carried a weight I couldn't name, a subtle language only my heart seemed to understand. I remember the way the evening light fell across his face, soft and golden, painting him as if he were part of a secret world I was only just discovering. It was a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable, and in that suspended silence, I realized something within me had shifted forever. Something dangerous. Something thrilling. Something I shouldn't have liked, but did. If you stay with me, you'll see this story unfold in ways that challenge comfort, blur the lines between curiosity and desire, and force a confrontation with secrets that were never meant to surface. Before we step fully into this story, take a moment, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the unraveling. Because what comes next will grip you in ways you can't forget. The first time he guided my hand, I felt an unfamiliar warmth crawl through my veins, a shiver that began in my fingertips and settled deep in my chest. It was meant to be simple, just a lesson, he said, a small correction to how I had been fumbling with the notes. But the brush of his fingers lingered, tracing shapes across my skin like a whispered secret, leaving a trail that burned longer than it should have. I remember the quietness of the room, the soft hum of the evening fan, the way shadows pooled in the corners, hiding us from the world while sharpening every sensation. My heart thudded in a rhythm that felt both absurd and undeniable, a wild drum in the stillness that seemed to echo everything I wasn't ready to name. He never forced attention. There was no urgency in his gaze, yet his eyes held a gravity that pulled me forward, an unspoken invitation I found impossible to resist. Each lesson began with ordinary words, instructions about technique or posture, yet beneath the surface, every sentence seemed to hum with something else, a subtle weight that made my pulse catch in anticipation. I would pretend to adjust my position, straighten my shoulders, and in those movements, I sensed him leaning closer, the air between us charged, electric, heavy. The closeness was intoxicating yet terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff that promised both freedom and ruin. The first time I noticed it consciously, I froze mid-motion, aware of the friction of our proximity, aware that my fingers had brushed his teeth longer than they needed to. The warmth radiating from his skin was unexpected, and yet, it drew me like a moth to a dimly glowing flame. I told myself it was curiosity, the simple desire to learn, to absorb, to mimic his confidence. But there was more. Something inside me shifted, unsteady and trembling, a recognition that some lines were being crossed even as they appeared invisible. I couldn't articulate it, couldn't name it, but the intensity of that single moment burned in memory, folding itself into every subsequent encounter. Evenings became a study in subtlety. The way he leaned over to correct my posture, the soft inflection in his voice, the deliberate patience that allowed my mistakes to linger just enough. Each detail was a lesson layered with sensation. I began to notice patterns, tiny signals that went beyond instruction, a hand that hovered longer than needed, a glance that felt weighted with understanding, a smile that lingered just a heartbeat too long. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was harmless, that my imagination was overactive. But imagination rarely felt this vivid, this persistent, as if reality itself had sharpened, every sense tuned to his presence, every moment pregnant with quiet tension. I remember the night the lesson ended and we stayed seated, neither of us moving immediately, the silence wrapping around us like a third presence in the room. My fingers brushed against the edge of the table, seeking something to ground me, while his gaze held mine with a patience that unsettled me. I felt exposed, not in shame, but in a raw vulnerability that made my skin tingle and my mind whirl. That lingering moment planted a seed, a quiet curiosity that I could not name yet would not forget. It was dangerous, of course, I knew that, but danger had never felt so compelling, so alive. In the days that followed, every encounter carried a similar electricity. I would anticipate the brush of his hand, the low cadence of his explanations, the subtle scent of him that seemed to linger even when he had left. My thoughts began to drift, weaving scenarios that were both innocent and impossibly charged, and I found myself craving the lessons not for knowledge alone but for the presence, for the subtle closeness that left me breathless and questioning. I began to notice the small ways I could prolong a moment, the shift of a chair, a hesitant pause, the way my voice softened unconsciously when he was near. These were small acts, almost imperceptible, yet each one deepened a pattern I felt powerless to resist. It was in these early sparks, these flickers of forbidden fascination, that I first understood the paradox of desire and restraint. I wanted to retreat, to shield myself from what I didn't fully comprehend, yet I craved it with a hunger that made rational thought feel like a distant memory. Every lesson became a delicate dance, choreographed by silence, glances, and the tension between what could be expressed and what could not. And in that careful, trembling rhythm, I realized something profound. Curiosity had a weight, a gravity of its own, and mine was pulling me irreversibly toward him. The room seemed smaller in those moments, compressed by the closeness, the heat, the subtle danger, until I could hear the quiet hum of my own pulse louder than the world outside. It was intoxicating and terrifying, like standing in a storm while the first drop of rain tasted like fire on my tongue. I told myself it was temporary, a phase of fascination, a fleeting spark that would pass. But even as I said it, even as I tried to convince myself, I knew that something had begun that could not be undone. A quiet ignition, subtle but irreversible, that would shape the days, the thoughts, and the trembling nights to come. The room felt smaller now, no longer just a place for instruction, but a chamber of heightened awareness where every movement carried a subtle weight and every word trembled with possibility. Lessons that once seemed harmless had taken on a new intensity, and I felt it in the air before he even spoke. The shift in posture, the deliberate calm in his voice, the way he allowed a silence to stretch, inviting me to fill it unknowingly with thought and sensation. I began to notice how close he would stand when correcting my position, the heat radiating from his body, the faint brush of his hand as it lingered just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was terrifying and irresistible all at once, a paradox I could not untangle. I found myself questioning boundaries I had never questioned before. Was it the way he looked at me, or the way my mind transformed his gaze into something charged? Was it desire, curiosity, or something deeper that I dared not name? Each lesson blurred into the next, an intricate choreography of touch and distance, words and pauses, the ordinary folded over by the extraordinary. My heart raced in ways I couldn't explain, and I began to sense a strange dependence on his presence, an unspoken gravity pulling me closer, a dangerous orbit from which I could not escape. One afternoon, he leaned over to adjust my posture, his breath brushing my ear in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the warmth of his chest against my shoulder, the subtle pressure of his fingers as they guided my hands, and my mind reeled at the intimacy of the moment. I told myself to focus on the lesson, to count each note, to measure each movement, yet all I could feel was the pulse of proximity, the quiet electricity that surged between us. There was a thrill in it, undeniably, but also a creeping fear that whispered, we were crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. I began to analyze every glance, every casual touch, replaying interactions in my mind with the precision of a scholar, dissecting intent and meaning until reality itself seemed uncertain. Was it intentional on his part, or was it my imagination weaving shadows into patterns of longing? I could not know, and the uncertainty was maddening. The boundary between instruction and intimacy had thinned, until even the simplest gesture, a hand hovering near mine, a smile that lingered, felt loaded with unspoken possibility. I found myself waiting for moments alone with him, craving the subtle closeness that no words could justify, and dreading the inevitable aftermath of every encounter. The tension began to ripple through my body in ways I could not control. Nights were sleepless, filled with memories that refused to remain dormant, and thoughts that blurred desire and guilt into a tangled knot I could not unravel. I questioned everything: my own feelings, my morality, the very nature of attraction and curiosity. Yet the more I resisted, the more acutely aware I became of his presence, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw me closer with every passing day. It was intoxicating, and the danger made it more potent, like a flame that both warms and threatens to consume. One evening, as sunlight waned into a soft amber dusk, our lesson stretched longer than usual. The room was quiet except for the rustle of paper and the faint hum of distant traffic outside. He leaned in, speaking in a tone so gentle, so patient, that it disarmed the part of me that demanded restraint. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle brush of his hand against mine, and I realized with a shock that I wanted more than instruction. I wanted the closeness, the touch, the subtle intimacy that had grown from the simplest of lessons. My pulse raced, my breath caught, and I felt an unfamiliar trembling in my chest, as though my body recognized something my mind could not yet articulate. It was in these stolen, suspended moments that I first understood the allure of crossing invisible lines. Every correction became a negotiation of proximity, every glance a silent conversation, and every touch a spark threatening to ignite something irreversible. I was no longer merely a student, nor was he merely a teacher. We existed in a liminal space, a private theater of tension and curiosity, where morality, desire, and secrecy collided in ways that left me breathless and unsettled. Each encounter was both a lesson and a revelation, a chance to explore the uncharted territories of sensation and emotion that I had never dared to traverse. By the end of the chapter, I was acutely aware that this was no longer a series of harmless lessons. Something had shifted irrevocably, an unspoken understanding that whatever existed between us had surpassed instruction and had entered the domain of personal, intimate consequence. I could not name it, could not define it, but I knew it had weight. It was a presence in my chest, a rhythm in my pulse, a quiet, insistent whisper in every thought. The invisible lines had been crossed, subtly but undeniably, and I sensed that what came next would test the boundaries of secrecy, desire, and trust in ways I could not yet imagine. The moments we shared became a language without words, spoken in stolen glances, fleeting touches, and the spaces between syllables. Each lesson, once a sanctuary of instruction, had become a chamber of unspoken truths, a place where the ordinary world could not intrude. I carried the weight of our secret everywhere, in the tilt of my head, in the way my hands hesitated in public, in the subtle tremor of my voice when he entered a room. The shadow of him lingered, an invisible presence that both exhilarated and terrified me. It was a private gravity that shaped every thought, every movement, and every heartbeat. I became an expert in concealment, perfecting smiles that hid storms, gestures that disguised desire, and conversations that left no trace of the turbulence inside me. Outside, I laughed, spoke, and moved as if nothing had changed, but within, the secrecy had grown roots, twisting through my thoughts with a slow, relentless force. The more I tried to maintain normalcy, the more I felt the tension of our hidden world pressing against the fragile walls I had built. Every encounter carried the possibility of exposure, and with it, a thrill that mingled danger and longing into something impossible to resist. The line between private and public became almost imperceptible. I began noticing the subtleties in his behavior when we were around others. A hand that lingered slightly longer than necessary, a glance that seemed to follow me even when he was speaking to someone else, a voice that carried a quiet warmth only I could feel. It was as though our secret had created an invisible thread between us, delicate and taut, vibrating with every small motion, every subtle intonation. I feared it, yet I craved it, a contradiction that left me unsteady on my own feet. There were nights when I replayed our moments in my mind, long after the lessons had ended, examining each detail with a scrutiny born of both longing and fear. I questioned my own reactions, my own desires, and whether I was being led or simply discovering parts of myself I had never known. Each reflection brought both shame and exhilaration, a duality that made sleep impossible and days unbearably slow. I began to feel a quiet obsession, a hunger not just for his presence, but for the understanding that seemed to exist only between us, a connection that defied reason and begged for secrecy. One evening, after a lesson stretched into the fading glow of twilight, we remained in the room longer than usual. The air was thick with unspoken acknowledgement, the kind of tension that vibrates through every nerve ending, leaving the body and mind on edge. I noticed the subtle shift in his posture as he leaned closer under the guise of instruction, the faint warmth radiating from him, and the way his gaze held mine. Heavy with intent I could neither define nor resist. In that suspended moment, the room seemed to shrink until the world beyond its walls ceased to exist, leaving only the electric, fragile tension between us. The secrecy was intoxicating. I found myself inventing reasons to linger, prolonging lessons, or pretending to need clarification, just to feel the quiet proximity and hear the gentle cadence of his voice. Every small touch, every brief encounter became magnified, a spark capable of igniting storms in the confines of my imagination. The thrill of being caught, or the mere thought of it, made my pulse race, intertwining fear and desire in a way that was both dangerous and impossible to disentangle. Yet secrecy came at a cost. The guilt was a shadow that followed me relentlessly, curling into my thoughts, whispering reminders of lines crossed and boundaries tested. I tried to compartmentalize, to convince myself that it was merely curiosity, merely an accident of proximity, but the depth of my fascination betrayed my rationalizations. Every small indulgence, every lingering moment, carried a weight I could not dismiss, a quiet reckoning that pressed against the fragile normalcy of my daily life. I began to understand the complexity of desire confined within secrecy, the way it amplifies, distorts, and transforms ordinary interactions into something intense, almost unbearable. It was a constant balancing act, the desire to reach for more, to test the limits of proximity and attention, and the instinct to retreat, to preserve what was acceptable, to avoid the unraveling that exposure would bring. The tension became a living thing between us, a fragile pulse that demanded both care and daring, a reminder that what we shared existed only in the shadows, yet shaped every fiber of my being. By the end of this chapter, I was acutely aware of the duality I inhabited, the private thrill of connection, the intoxicating pull of intimacy, and the public mask that had to remain flawless. Secrets had woven themselves into the fabric of my existence, and I could feel, with an almost painful clarity, that the more we indulged, the further we were drawn into a realm from which there might be no return. The shadows had become our sanctuary, but also our prison, a quiet tension that neither of us could release, leaving me to wonder how long desire could remain hidden before it demanded acknowledgement in the light. The lessons had ceased to be just our secret. They had begun to leave traces beyond the room, subtle imprints on the way I moved, spoke, and even thought. I could feel eyes on me where none had intended, notice whispers in tones that might or might not be about me, and sense a tension that had begun to leak into every space I occupied. Our intimacy, once confined and invisible, had begun to ripple outward, touching corners of life I had not anticipated. There was a quiet paranoia in it, a sense that even the walls might have ears, that every glance from a family member or friend could carry scrutiny I could not escape. He seemed to feel it too. In lessons, there were moments when his gaze lingered longer, but with a weight I hadn't noticed before, an awareness of consequences pressing down on us both. I sensed hesitation in his movements, a careful choreography of touch and distance that betrayed the gravity of our secret. The room itself seemed smaller, the air thicker, as if the outside world were pressing in, reminding us that intimacy confined to shadows could not remain invisible indefinitely. The thrill of secrecy began to taste of danger, and yet, paradoxically, that danger made the connection between us feel more vital, more alive. Family interactions became delicate performances. I caught myself adjusting my expressions, controlling the inflections of my voice, bending my posture to convey nothing more than ordinary composure. Yet every ordinary moment was charged, threaded with the awareness of our shared secret, a tremor beneath the surface that only I could feel. I started noticing the patterns of suspicion in others, or perhaps inventing them in my mind, each innocuous glance magnified into a potential revelation. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and profoundly isolating, as though the world had contracted to a narrow corridor through which only I moved, burdened with knowledge that could not be shared. Occasionally, fleeting moments of public interaction made my pulse catch in ways our private encounters never had. A casual brush of his hand in a crowded room, a smile too warm, a question asked in passing that carried unspoken undertones. They became reminders that the shadows we inhabited were not impermeable. Every small action had the potential to unravel the delicate lattice of concealment we had constructed. I felt as though I were walking a tightrope stretched across an abyss, every heartbeat measured, every gesture deliberate, and yet no step guaranteed safety. The psychological weight was unrelenting. I began to see how secrecy warps perception, how desire confined to private spaces can grow obsessive and all-consuming. I questioned myself constantly. Was it truly the lessons, or had I allowed curiosity and longing to twist into something more? Was it a reflection of him, or had I created this tension entirely in my own mind? The answers were never clear, only magnified by the persistent undercurrent of our hidden connection. Every day was a negotiation between indulgence and restraint, intimacy and exposure, reality and imagination. Our bond began to affect more than just our interactions. It shaped moods, decisions, and relationships around us. Moments of family life became fraught with the unspoken tension we carried, subtle signs of conflict and unease emerging where none should have existed. I could sense the widening ripples of influence, the way private choices begin to shape the world in ways both visible and invisible. It was as if our secret were a stone dropped into a still pond, each wave reaching farther than I had ever anticipated, touching lives, perceptions, and emotions in quiet but profound ways. Even as I acknowledged these external reverberations, I could not stop the pull of our closeness. The same magnetic force that had drawn me into his orbit remained, stronger and more urgent than ever. It was a dangerous paradox. The more I feared consequences, the more I desired the moments of proximity, the brush of hands, the quiet cadence of his voice in shared silence. I realized then that secrecy amplifies not only risk, but intensity, and that the emotional cost of exposure is inseparable from the ecstasy of hidden intimacy. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that our world could no longer exist only in the shadows. The consequences, both real and imagined, were seeping into every corner of life, creating fractures I could not mend and pressures I could not evade. Desire had become entangled with guilt, secrecy with danger, and intimacy with inevitable reckoning. The walls that had once protected us from the outside world now felt porous, fragile, and insufficient, leaving me acutely aware that the next step, whatever it would be, could alter everything irreversibly. The tension that had quietly pulsed beneath every interaction could no longer be contained. It surfaced suddenly, like a storm breaking over a fragile landscape, relentless and unyielding. I could feel it in every fiber of my body, the pull of what had been forbidden, the weight of secrecy, and the stark, unavoidable clarity that our hidden world had reached its tipping point. Even the air seemed charged with expectation, dense and almost suffocating, as though every unspoken thought, every suppressed desire had coalesced into a single, inescapable moment. He was there, as always, calm in appearance yet undeniably affected by the same currents that had shaped my own days and nights. I could see it in the subtle tension in his shoulders, the lingering pause before he spoke, the intensity of his gaze that seemed to strip away every pretense. For the first time, the lessons, the touch, the secrecy, all of it, was laid bare between us, unshielded and inescapable. There were no shadows to hide behind, no corners where desire could safely dwell. Every unspoken thought demanded acknowledgement, and in that acknowledgement lay both danger and release. The confrontation was quiet, almost fragile, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. Words stumbled at first, hesitant and careful, each syllable weighed with the gravity of truth. I tried to articulate feelings that had been simmering for months, desires tangled with guilt, longing intertwined with fear. His responses were measured, reflective, neither dismissive nor indulgent, but charged with the same awareness that had bound us together from the beginning. We both understood that what had existed in secrecy had irrevocably changed us, leaving a trail of complexity and emotion that could not simply be erased. In the aftermath, everything felt heightened, charged with a strange combination of relief and uncertainty. The secrecy that had once sharpened every glance and gesture was gone, replaced by the stark clarity of acknowledgement. The intimacy we had shared, once confined to shadows, now existed in full awareness, its consequences no longer deferred. There was guilt, undeniably, and a sense of loss for the fragile world that had allowed closeness without consequence. But there was also understanding, of desire, of human complexity, and of the subtle, powerful forces that shape connection between two people. Life beyond the confrontation was altered irrevocably. Family dynamics, once seemingly stable, shifted in ways I could not fully control, subtle fractures forming where once there had been unspoken trust. Social interactions carried a new weight, the knowledge of emotional landscapes forever changed, and the quiet awareness that certain truths, once revealed, can never be undone. Every smile, every gesture, every fleeting touch in the outside world now carried layers of meaning, and I became acutely aware of the delicate balance between presence and perception, intimacy and exposure. Yet even amidst the fallout, there was a strange beauty in the reckoning. The journey from curiosity to desire, secrecy to confrontation, had illuminated the contours of my own emotions in ways I could not have anticipated. I understood, with a clarity born of experience and reflection, that desire, once awakened, cannot be contained. It must be confronted, acknowledged, and integrated into the fabric of who we are. There was pain, undeniably, and there was confusion. Yet there was also insight, a deep, almost painful awareness of human complexity, of morality, of longing, and of the intricate dance between risk and reward that defines intimacy. By the final moments, I was left with an indelible understanding of consequence and transformation. What had begun as lessons in a quiet room had grown into a labyrinth of emotion, secrecy, and revelation. I had crossed invisible lines, inhabited shadows, and faced truths that reshaped not only my relationships, but the core of my self-awareness. The echo of those moments, both forbidden and illuminating, would linger long after the encounters themselves had ended, a quiet testament to the power of desire, the weight of secrecy, and the irrevocable impact of intimate connection. And yet, despite the turbulence, despite the moral ambiguity and the lingering ache of forbidden attachment, there remained a truth that could not be denied. The experience, in all its intensity and complication, had irrevocably changed me. It had revealed depths of feeling, currents of emotion, and the raw edges of human desire that I had never fully known. I had been tested, shaped, and transformed, and though the future remained uncertain, I carried with me the weight and clarity of experience, the lingering resonance of forbidden connection, and the haunting, undeniable beauty of moments lived fully, even when they existed only in the shadows.